radio rebelde a las puertas de Santiago de Cuba. Atención, muy importante. Ahora viene a los micrófonos de Radio Rebelde el líder máximo de la revolución cubana, el doctor.
Welcome. You're watching Video Rebelde with your host, Nina Gonzalez. I have the pleasure this morning of speaking with Helen Yaffe, lecturer in Economic and Social History at Glasgow University, where her teaching mainly focuses on Latin America and Cuba. Cuba, like the rest of the world, has been battling with COVID-19 and has done so very successfully. However, on the top of all this, Cuba has been struggling with the asphyxiating blockade. Helen, you have recently returned from Cuba. What effect has the blockade had on everyday life?
Well, you're correct to say that Cuba, the Cuban economy has been very hard hit by the pandemic. But just to be clear, that the Cuban economy was also reeling from the impact of a set of new coercive measures and sanctions and actions that were implemented under the Trump administration, particularly since 2019. And they had the express intention of starving Cuba of resources, of its international partnerships, scaring off international investors, obstructing its access to basic goods like oil, and just goods that it needs as inputs for its production. And yeah, so I would say that since about summer 2019, you've seen return to Cuba, and I say return because I'm referring back to the special period of the 1990s, of quite severe shortages and austerity. And, you know, because Cuba has a socialist state, what they do in this scenario is they, mobilize scarce resources and try to ensure there is some fairness and distribution so that, everyone's suffering shortages equally in a sense. The situation, as I say, had already deteriorated by 2019. We were seeing that Cubans were having to get up very early before work and join exhausting queues. I mean, I was actually in Cuba in last December and January, and that was already the scenario. So by the time we get to this summer, when I return to Cuba, you're talking about probably, about 2 years of this really exhausting economic hardships, which are very clearly externally imposed. Now, there may be all sorts of internal problems in Cuba, and there may be, issues to do with, why are policies announced and not implemented, but that's beside the point. The point is that Cuba's room for maneuver is very much restricted by this externally imposed sanctions. And that is the intention. The intention is to see those exhausting daily queues and a daily struggle for existence. Because if you look back at 1960, when the idea of sanctions against Cuba was first being mooted in the United States, and you have this Lester Mallory, a special assistant for Western Hemispheric Affairs, or whatever his title was, and he was proposing sanctions, and he said, look, we have to recognize that the Cuban Revolution and the leadership has a great deal of support. It's moving towards communism. There's evidence of that, but trying to invade is not going to help our cause. So what we really need to do is target them economically to create economic deterioration, which will create, and these are his words, hunger, desperation, and as a result, overthrow of government. So the United States policy has been a true two-track policy throughout the 62 years since the Cuban Revolution, which is on the one hand economic asphyxiation, to create that daily hardship, to obstruct Cuban development, to curtail the potential, and to undermine the ability of the Cuban Revolution to provide an alternative socialist development model. And at the same time, the second track has been to try and exploit the discontent, hardship, and frustration in order to foster an internal opposition with the objective, ultimately, of achieving regime change, the end of the Cuban Revolution.
Yeah, so from the pandemic worsened it, and the tightening of the sanctions, it has really brought it all to a head.
Yeah, so from 2019, the Bush administration had taken measures to stop Cuba getting any access to oil imports. So it threatened to fine the shipping companies which were carrying essential oil from Venezuela to Cuba. It then threatened to fine the insurance companies and the insurance companies that insure the insurance companies. Mm-hmm. It also, after 23 years of presidential signature suspending Title III of the Helms-Burton Act, the Trump administration fully implemented this act, which gives US interests, and that includes, by the way, which is an abnormality of this law, Cubans who were Cuban citizens at the time when the events happened, 1960, 61, and so on. It gives them retrospective US citizenship, which is an illegal abnormality, and then allows them to take to court to make legal demands against anyone who is, as they say, trafficking in property that previously belonged to them or companies they were involved in. So the idea is to scare off foreign investment at exactly the point when Cubans have a development plan, the National Development Plan to 2030, which gives a key pivotal role to foreign investment to help to upgrade their infrastructure and to raise the standard of living in Cuba. So there was those measures. They also, the Trump administration then banned cruises to Cuba at a time when US visitors to Cuba was over 600,000. They banned subsequently flights to Cuba. So then they've blocked remittances. So basically they have tried to identify every stream of revenue or income for Cuba and eliminate it. One of the other elements of what the Trump administration did, a really insidious mechanism, was for them to eliminate what's called U-turn transactions within the financial system. And these were mechanisms that allowed the Cubans to still use the international financial system despite US sanctions being in place. And it's very complex, but the point is that the Cubans were still able to do trade with the world, and those have been eliminated under the Trump administration. So what happened was then, that's already the context, March 2020, then you have COVID-19 being declared as a pandemic. And Cuba did the sensible thing from an epidemiological point of view, from a sanitary point of view. They closed their borders. But of course, this meant they were really hard hit by the loss of tourism income, which is the second most significant source of income for Cuba. And, in that annual year, January to December is how the Cubans do their year, the GDP fell 11%. If you think about that, that's 11% is 1/3 almost of the plummet of GDP during the special period after the collapse of the Soviet bloc, when Cuba lost nearly 90% of its trade and investment, which had taken place with the Soviet Union and the other Eastern Bloc socialist countries. So it's a very severe economic crisis. At the same time, you have this sanitary, global health crisis, where Cuba has had to take all of its reserves and dedicate them to providing an adequate response to COVID-19, to providing a high level of healthcare. So people in Cuba, when they have symptoms or a contact, they were being taken straight to supervised medical care. not left to suffer in silence at home, and all the rest of it. And so, and they have invested, you know, massive resources in their biotech sector. It's been fruitful. They have now produced, they have 2 COVID-19 vaccines which are being rolled out to the population. They have several others that are finishing clinical trials. They have a pediatric vaccine for children to protect them from COVID-19 and so on. But it means that, you know, they have dedicated scarce resources to dealing with the pandemic. And this has really just compounded the situation. So in the house where I live in Cuba, people are getting up at dawn, I mean 3:30, 4:30 in the morning to go and join queues outside shops or distribution centres where the goods might not even come in until 10 or 11 later that morning. So that's 8 hours of queuing. And then many people will be moving on to their full-time employment or full-time caring or whatever it is they're doing. So, I mean, it is really tough on that level. And just to be clear, there is no targeting of the leadership or targeting of any elite in Cuba. This affects every single Cuban in every sector and every area of the country.
Yeah, and I think even those, you know, it affects children, it affects old people. I presume you've seen this, whether and correct me if I'm wrong, but you know, when it comes to antibiotics, or it comes to blood pressure medicine, or you know, whatever the situation, could, you know, vulnerable people, you I suppose likewise that it affects them just the same.
Yeah, I mean, there is an alarming shortage of antibiotics, of paracetamol and ibuprofen for children, children's medicines in general. And, you know, the government is doing what it can, but it is basically, you know, up against a brick wall. They have just passed a new piece of legislation allowing people, regulation rather, allowing people to bring in large quantities of medicine, and the idea that this was to meet demand. But then they're finding that a lot of this medicine that's being bought in by, you know, by individuals is being resold on the so-called black market or informal market for high prices. So it's a really big problem. I mean, Cuba has an incredible biopharma capacity for a small island nation. It has the capacity to produce nearly 70% of the medicines consumed by its population. Nonetheless, it still requires inputs for that production process. And those inputs have been obstructed with the recent tightening of sanctions. And that's why we're seeing a sudden new shortage of medicines. And I mean, it's to the point where I've been talking about their capacity with vaccine development, the only country in Latin America and the Caribbean to have a homegrown vaccine. At the same time, they're struggling to buy syringes to carry out the mass vaccination campaign. So it's this very awful, painful dichotomy. On the one hand, they are among the very few entities, countries in the world that have the capacity to produce very sophisticated biotech vaccines. On the other hand, global production of syringes, something that is cheap and easy to produce, is dominated by firms that have some link to the United States. And there is an article that appeared explaining with the case with each of these firms, how it was either a partner with a US company or has had a subsidiary in the United States or a laboratory in the United States. And all of these are reasons in the, you know, extremely complex, comprehensive sanctions by the United States that they can stop Cuba being able to purchase these syringes. So that is, you know, it's an awful situation. I imagine for the Cuban medical scientists, it's very painful indeed to know that they have this capacity and it's being obstructed by punitive sanctions, which, you know, stem from the Cold War era, from the 1960s, and as a punishment to Cuba for having.
Yeah, it sounds extremely unnecessary, very frustrating, you know, and punitive, like you say. I think, would I be right in saying it's a lot of raw materials? It's maybe just one ingredient in an antibiotic they're missing, or maybe one part of a certain, would it be some kind of equipment for hospital? It's not always. And if people wanted to help, really, where would you suggest that they help, rather than sending, there's a lot of individuals sending medicine. So what is the best way for people to help, would you suggest?
Yeah. So I mean, on that, people, hear from their friends and family in Cuba, and they get very upset and they want to provide immediate alleviation. That's completely understandable. But, we have to recognize that the way that the institutions are set up in Cuba is that they are always seeking to have a fair distribution. So getting material aid to an institution in Cuba is going to ultimately be able to help more people. So there's lots of international campaigns at the moment to help Cuba to purchase not just syringes, but sort of test tubes and other things that it needs for its mass vaccination campaign. And I would say that's quite a priority at the moment. The Cubans in the UK has a campaign in Britain. There is a Saving Lives campaign in the United States. And I know that there are similar campaigns in all around Europe and around the world.
Yeah, well, there's MediCuba, which is in Switzerland, and our own Cuba Support Group Ireland, and many groups around Europe fund MediCuba, and MediCuba has a direct link with the Cuban
Ministry of Health.
Exactly. So they, in a way, get a shopping list from them, and they know exactly what they need. And MediCuba are made up of medical experts, so they know how to purchase and what exactly they need. So like that, it might be just one ingredient for an antibiotic, or syringes, or whatever they need. So you're targeting exactly what they need. And actually, it in a way, the Cubans, of course, they know what they need. They don't need us to tell them. They just need a way of getting it. So I think,
I just give you a couple of personal examples, as I think it helps. I mean, just under the sort of circle of people that I know in Cuba, there was a young woman who's had a wisdom tooth taken out and then got subsequent infection, and was there with a lump in, very, very painful lump in her jaw, because the antibiotics hadn't entered the country and she couldn't access them. Once she did, Cuba's working very hard to get hold of those things. Another person who had a terrible motorbike accident and had a broken leg needed plaster, but they don't have what they need for, plaster of Paris, and instead have had to use some strip of cement at the back and then bandaging. So, I mean, just things like that create unnecessary suffering. It's really, it's real cruelty.
It's cruelty. And could you explain a little bit about the food situations of the markets, the distribution of food, and have they had to create, because obviously they have been famous for, the agroponicos. How is that being rebooted, if you like, or what are they short of, and what's not coming in, and how are those, because we've also heard of donations arriving from other countries. Has that, I'm sure it's been positive, but of course you can't control then, it's not like going shopping. People are giving you what they think you need again. So it's never as good as buying yourself. So what could you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it, people can say, well, why does Cuba, it's still import 50% of its food needs, or it's 70% of the estimates are 70% of the ration is imported, and why is it in the, this is a weak, vulnerable position? And you can ask that. It's a genuinely good question. But I've recently looked more into the history of Cuba's food dependence, and actually we have to be clear, without going into great detail or long lecture, that this is a historical legacy of the colonial model, the Spanish control of Cuba, and the imposition of a sugar plantation economy, right? Which eliminated food production and made the country dependent on exports of sugar, but also imports of food. Now, Nina, what is one of the most important staples of Cubans' diet?
Arroz, no? Rice and bread.
Rice, right. So, the Cuban population is sort of hooked on a food that is very, it basically needs a lot of water, and domestic production is always going to be limited. So it's dependent on imports. But then there are also other questions. So you also know how much pork is eaten in Cuba. But the pork production has collapsed recently on small farms and so on because of the problem of farmers getting hold of feed for their pork production. So, you know, feed comes externally as well, or it's this case of the Cuban state has a limited set of resources and they have basically had to channel, you know, the vast majority of them into combating COVID-19 and a global health crisis and protecting the population from that. And that's what they prioritize. So there are big problems. I mean, you know, people are frustrated by the diminishing diversity of food available. There's more reliance now on the state distribution system, which takes different forms, and also the shops, which are, you know, prices controlled by the state. But prices have gone up massively. This is another big problem. This was forewarned. It was a result of the monetary unification. Salaries went up significantly, a lot of them by 3 or 4 times. But food prices have gone up, and you know, for those people who didn't benefit from salary rises because they don't work or they're on pensions, it's been tough as well. And I don't think that the government could foresee how much worse the pandemic would become, and they had gone ahead with this process in the assumption that, you know, there would be an uptick in tourist visitors and so on. So in terms of agricultural production, you know, the hit on oil imports to Cuba, that was a conscious policy of the Trump administration, has meant that there's no oil for tractors or less oil for tractors. So a lot of goods are rotting in the field because they can't be harvested.
And that would be with trucks that are bringing in food and the distribution. Refrigeration, I'm sure, is also when you've got power plants and refrigeration. I'm sure that's also an issue.
I mean, we saw quite a lot of fruit and veg, of fruit and veg, which is domestically grown, locally grown to wherever you're seeing it sold. But the prices has risen, number one, and secondly, you know, in the Cuban diet, rice, as we said, but also meat has a sort of high priority, and that's where I think there is quite severe shortages. And then, of course, they took the decision to open the hard currency stores, which, if you look at the economic background, we've been talking about the block on U-turn transactions which stopped Cubans being able to use the international financial system to make payments. And they took the decision to open hard currency stores in order to get the hard currency in cash that they need to make those international purchases. And it was a tough decision, and it has been detrimental to individual Cubans, although I do recognize that it was driven by necessity. They needed some way to collect hard currency, and in those MLC, to shop in them, you need a bank card, you need to have hard currency, and that has also seen prices in those stores are much more elevated as well.
So after talking about all that, do you think, Helen, then, because obviously here, while you were in Cuba, and while we were here in the UK and Ireland, there was a lot of focus on the protests that happened in Cuba, like they did all over the world, may I mention, but because it was so unusual for Cuba. Do you think what you have just spoken about has something to do with that?
Well, going back to that dual track policy of the United States at the inception of the US blockade and aggression against Cuba from 1960, the idea is, you know, you have this backdrop of economic asphyxiation, austerity, shortages, creating frustration and so on. But at the same time, you have the campaign to foster an internal opposition. And in recent years, as the Cuban government extended internet access, so now millions of Cubans have access to the internet on their mobile phones, that is to say, inside their homes. And this has been a vehicle, very consciously, part of a planned program, the vehicle for promoting internal dissent, or as they put it in 1960, overthrow of government, has been through social media. So you have a kind of perfect storm for Cuba in the sense that there's a lot of young people in particular who, because of COVID and the sanitary restrictions, have not been at school or college, universities, and not been connected to their usual study forums and their usual organizations for students, and the forums for debate, discussion, complaint and response and so on. And you also have people outside of work, workplaces closed, people working from home or one in on each day and so on. So you've had a sort of breakdown of the traditional political forms of mobilization, of linkages that Cubans have. The same goes for neighborhoods. The neighborhood meetings haven't been taking place, all in the interests of, sanitary regulations and good COVID-19 management. Yeah. But what this means is that you have this section of young people, and their overriding influence has come through social media into their homes.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, and it is the product of a well-polished, very well-funded, well-oiled campaign to promote regime change. Mm-hmm. So, in terms of the protests, it's not right to sort of say all the protesters, right? There were clearly different people there representing different interests and with different agendas. On the one hand, there was clearly a core of people who were consciously part of a regime change program funded, since 2009, USAID, the Agency for International Development, which receives the 20 million roughly funds from the US Congress every year. They are funded through programs to carry out what they call democracy promotion, which we recognize as regime change promotion. So there are clearly a core that are there, coordinated, guided, directed from outside. Then there is an element of people who are what the Cubans have referred to as delinquents, or we can say criminal elements. So people who are probably anyway outside work and employment, and they have criminal records, right? And, the Cuban media was sort of, without saying names, was giving examples of the criminal records of the people that they had arrested. And then you have a third layer of people who the Cuban state should be most concerned about. And these are the people who are living through this really tough experience, and they're frustrated and exhausted, and they have been subject to this sophisticated campaign, and they are, they are falling for it or manipulated by it, and they have joined in. Yeah. I think probably, and this is from testimony of people who came across the protest, there was probably a large layer of people who were there who had seen it in the street and went to see what was going on. Because I know someone who saw one of the protests, and people, she was asking, why are you here? And they said, oh, we're just seeing what's going on. I don't know what's happening. So, you know what it's like in Cuba. Two people stand in the street and have an animated discussion, and a crowd.
Of course, and I suppose they've had a year of being, very quiet. They're not used to that. They're used, very in their house. They're used to getting out. They're used to being very social. And even that about the healthcare, they're used to being quite in control of know what's going on with their healthcare, because there was a lot of hypocrisy coming out that the Cubans weren't told about what was going on, or that the Cubans needed vaccines, or that the Cubans needed internet. Things which I think they definitely don't need.
I think we need to say that the protests took place on the 11th of July. I know that there was another protest in another area on the outskirts of Havana on the 12th. But essentially, I travelled around Havana on the following day, and it was a tense calm, but very, very calm. And as we walked through Havana, all of the taxis that were parked at the side of the street and through the workplaces that we could walk past on the main road were all tuned in to listen to a 4-hour discussion program by the president, Miguel Diaz-Canel, and all of the ministers. They came rotated around that table, explaining, talking to Cubans, explaining the situation in San Antonio, where the protests had turned violent on the 11th, where Miguel Diaz-Canel had gone down to. They had suffered for a couple of days with electricity blackouts, which are obviously reminiscent of the special period of the 1990s. And they were explaining, you know, in technical detail about why these had happened and how it's to do with the kind of fuel that comes in and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And actually the only protests or mobilizations that we saw since then were those in support of the government. So I think it's really important to make clear, because there was incredible media manipulation. I mean, I couldn't see until people were saying to me, you know, it sounds like the whole of Cuba, 1 million people are out in Havana protesting against the government. And of course it was so much manipulation. People did go out in their thousands in the afternoon of the 11th. And that was after the president had gone on the television and very impassioned speech, recognizing their legitimate frustrations and concerns about the daily difficulties, but at the same time identifying that there was a core group who were part of a well-funded, paid external campaign. And he said, he called for the revolutionaries to be out in the streets. He said the streets belong to the revolutionaries. And in response to that, thousands of Cubans went out in support of the Cuban government, socialism, against US imperialism, against the US blockade. And a lot of the images from those pro-government protests were manipulated and presented, including in the New York Times and other mainstream presses, as being opposition activists, and they simply weren't. But it was worse than that. They showed on the 11th of July, the same day, Argentina won the America's Cup, and you know, tens of thousands, if not, I don't know, hundreds of thousands were out, and a photo of that was circulated as being protests on the Malecon. A photo of protests on the Malecon in Egypt from 2011 was circulated.
In Alexandria, I think it was. There was so much manipulation, and obviously they wanted to make it. When I say they, I mean the US interests wanted to make it seem so much more than it was. They just blew it out of all proportion and manipulated, gave masses of fake news. And once that goes out, that was the image that's left, and then you have to counter all that, you know.
Yeah, but people have moved on, is because it's not used anymore.
So what you're saying is there's been good dialogue. The discussions have happened, and the dialogue between the government and the people, and they you know, has been good.
What I'm saying, is that they, you know, it has served as a how to put this politely. It has served as impelled.
I know,
you know, the leadership to tackle long-standing problems of engagement and participation, and to get out into the barrios. You may have seen that the president
a few days ago
went to San Isidro. But the other thing is, it has, you know, fortified the ordinary Cubans who might not be in party political leadership or, you know, organization, but they are ordinary Cubans, and they, you know, were pretty horrified by the violence. And stories about a children's hospital being attacked in Holguin during the protests. And you know, and the children, infant patients and their mothers having to cower under the beds. I mean, that has horrified a lot of people. And you know, they would totally and utterly reject the violence and reject US intervention, whether or not they, you know, think that there's problems or the government's managed the situation well or not. They absolutely reject the violence and the interference, and they.
I mean, Cubans are the first to talk about their problems. They're always talking about. They're very vocal about what they need and what they want, but they're also extremely protective of their safety and their security and their freedom of their children being able to go out. And they're not used to any kind of violence. Thankfully, it's not a thing they're numb to. They would be very raw to that, and they would not be used to it. And I don't think they could even imagine having any kind of violence, because that's not something they're used to, which is a really wonderful thing. The hypocrisy is nauseating.
It is actually disgusting. Right,
Yeah.
you know, even for Biden, just this one fact that Biden can come out and talk about a failed state when Cuba has its first day of protest in 27 years. And the last protest, by the way, was in one place, right, for a few hours. And, you know, this is a man who almost couldn't ascend to the presidency because of a right-wing uprising coup, whatever you want to call it, right? You know, an invasion of their sacrosanct. You know, this is a country where there are violent protests every day, several thousands of people. This is a country where we see the kind of tragic, you know, gun violence, and you know, I don't want to go into any sort of descriptive detail because we know what we're talking about. And to talk about Cuba as a failed state, I mean, it's and to talk about assisting Cuba with internet access when for many years Cuba could not access the internet because there was something like 34 optic fiber cables passing the island, which Cuba was prohibited from accessing because of US sanctions. And to talk about assisting Cuba with its vaccines when it can't, you know, it's struggling, it has to call on the international community in solidarity with Cuba to access syringes, you know, I mean, the hypocrisy is so disgusting that it should clarify exactly where Biden and his type stand. And all of the Cuban American politicians, the mayor of Miami, who was calling for Cuba to be calling for airstrikes against Cuba, you know, we should be absolutely clear of whose interests they represent. They certainly are not interested in the well-being of the Cuban population.
And I just wanted to reflect that because we've also found with our work with our own group that there's a huge misconception when Obama was in the White House that all sanctions were lifted, and in fact it was only some diplomatic avenues, and yet what difference that made to the Cubans, because you know they're very innovative people, but if you know, it was like taking a piece of paper and putting a pinhole through it. That's all Obama did, yet the difference that had made in Cuba was massive. So I mean, just to reflect that it has become so very, I mean, you know, asphyxiating is one of you know, crippling, that how you can ask someone to swim or to move when they have their hands and their feet tied is disgusting, in fact, you know. So when actually they just need to be left alone in peace.
But how desperate are they, Nina? How desperate are they to destroy the Cuban example, to destroy the idea that there is an alternative method of development, right? To destroy the socialist development model. They're that desperate because, as you say, a tiny little bit of opening up under the Obama administration, and you know, the Cuban economy started to recover, and you know, there was a lot of creativity and exchange with people around the world, and you know, hundreds of companies are lined up to carry out investments at Mariel under the very strict conditions that the Cubans impose in terms of environmental checks and, you know, preserving the environment and workers' conditions. And there were still hundreds of companies ready to do business with highly educated.
Mariel is just to clarify, is the port in Havana, which is almost a gateway, a key to the rest of Latin America. Would I be right in saying that? So
it's a port that has been developed with billions of dollars. First with Brazil has helped to invest billions under Dilma Rousseff, who inaugurated the port in, gosh, was it 2014? And then it's just a key geostrategic location. I mean, that's been Cuba's sin in some ways, to be in such a key geostrategic location. You know, globally, that's why it was subject to so much interest and rivalry between the colonial powers. So Mariel is a special development zone, and the idea is that foreign investors can come in and bring high tech, businesses and so on, and Cuba will benefit from technology transfers and the rest of it. So and that would bring, I suppose, that brings another layer other than tourism. It brings other talents and other. It can bring so much more in, which is good to have it not so mono, not just tourism. I mean, they have other things, but so that's all stopped. That's all closed. There's nothing now that they have no more. Well, no, there are still companies there investing. There are still companies. We were hoping to go and see, because I was in Cuba actually doing work, and we were hoping to go and see a solar panel park, which is in Mariel Special Development Zone. And that is the product of a joint venture with a British and I think British-Chinese company. And Mariel is going ahead, and there are still companies interested. But, any country or company that has the intention to do business with the United States as well is going to, is going to be scared off. And that's the intention.
I just want to thank you, Helen, for joining me this morning. It was really valuable to have your inputs, and I hope you'll join me again another day on another topic.
Más unidos y firmes que nunca deben estar el pueblo y el ejército rebelde para no dejarse arrebatar la victoria que ha costado tanta sangre. Fueron las palabras de nuestro comandante jefe, doctor Fidel Castro, en trascendentales declaraciones al pueblo de Cuba.